The security officer's hand tightened on the radio, his thumb hovering, as the old man in the grey coat refused to step away from the restricted door. "Sir, last warning," the officer said, voice clipped, sharp, trained to command. "You do not have authorization to be here." The man didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply looked past the officer, through the glass wall, toward the runway where the plane idled, engines breathing like a living thing waiting to be unleashed. His eyes were steady. Too steady. And that calm made everyone nervous. The boarding bridge at Reagan National Airport hummed with tension. The smell of jet fuel mixed with burnt coffee and winter coats damp from sleet. Travelers stood frozen, phones half raised, sensing something was wrong, but not yet knowing what. A flight attendant whispered to another, her hand covering her mouth. A pilot leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching the standoff, like a referee who already knew the game had turned ugly. The man's name was Daniel Mercer, 62 years old, thin frame, silver hair cut short, practical, unremarkable. His coat was wool, worn at the cuffs. His shoes were clean but old, the kind bought once and repaired forever. Nothing about him suggested urgency or power. He looked like someone's retired uncle, the kind of man people step around in airports without noticing. "You're holding up an entire flight," the gate supervisor snapped, stepping forward. She was in her 40s, efficient, pressed uniform, the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. "If you miss this departure, that's on you. Now move." Daniel finally turned to face her, slowly, like a camera easing into focus. "I'm not trying to board," he said. His voice was low, controlled, edged with something that made the nearest officer shift his stance. "I'm trying to leave." The supervisor blinked. "Then leave. The exit's behind you." Daniel shook his head once. A small movement, deliberate. Not like this. Behind the glass, the aircraft door remained open. Inside, passengers waited, restless. A woman in first class tapped her watch, lips pursed. A man across the aisle muttered about missed connections. The cabin crew felt it too, that subtle wrongness in the air, the sense that a routine delay was curdling into something else. 20 minutes earlier, none of this had existed. Daniel Mercer had arrived at the airport alone. No driver, no entourage. He had checked in at a kiosk, declined assistance, carried one leather bag that looked older than most of the people rushing past him. He moved slowly, but not weakly, the way men do when they've learned that speed is not the same as control. At the coffee stand, the barista had asked if he wanted help with the lid. He'd smiled and said no thank you. She'd smiled back, relieved. At the gate, he'd taken a seat near the window, watching planes cut clean lines through a grey sky. He listened to the announcements without reacting. When boarding began, he waited. When his group was called, he stood. No rush, no eye contact, no friction. The problem started the moment he stepped onto the jet bridge. "Sir." The voice had come from behind him, firm, female, professional but edged. He turned to see the senior flight attendant, name tag reading Karen Whitlock, late 50s, hair pinned tight, eyes sharp with the authority of decades in uniform. She glanced at his boarding pass, then at him, then back at the pass. "This doesn't look right," she said. Daniel leaned in slightly, careful not to crowd her. "What doesn't?" She tapped the screen. "Your seat assignment." He waited. "You're listed in the forward cabin," she continued, tone shifting, smoothing itself into something rehearsed. "That section is full." Daniel frowned, just a little. "It shouldn't be." Karen's lips tightened. She looked past him, down the bridge, as if measuring who might be watching. "We had an equipment change, weight and balance issues. It happens." He nodded once. "Then I assume everyone affected was reassigned." Her eyes flicked back to him, a beat too slow. "Sir, I need you to step aside." Inside the plane, the captain had noticed the pause. Captain Alan Reeves, 57, broad-shouldered, old school. He leaned out of the cockpit, assessing. He saw Daniel's coat, the bag, the way he stood. He made a decision without realizing he was making one. "Is there a problem?" Reeves asked, his voice carrying. Karen didn't answer right away. She gestured vaguely. Seat confusion. Reeves stepped closer. He didn't look at Daniel at first. He spoke to Karen. "We're on a tight window." Then he turned. His gaze moved over Daniel, quick, efficient, final. "Sir," Reeves said, "we're going to need you to take a different seat." Daniel met his eyes. The hum of the plane filled the space between them. "I paid for the seat on that bus," Daniel said, "and I plan to sit in it." Reeves exhaled through his nose. "This isn't a debate." Karen shifted beside him, arms folding. A younger attendant hovered nearby, eyes darting, silent. Passengers behind Daniel craned their necks. "Then why does it feel like one?" Daniel asked. That was when Reeves's expression changed, just slightly. A tightening at the corners of his mouth. "Sir," he said, louder now, "I'm responsible for this aircraft. If you don't comply, I can have you removed." The word landed hard. Removed. A murmur rippled through the line. Phones came up. Someone whispered, "Here we go." Daniel looked at the open cabin door, then back at the captain. His voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. "I'm not refusing to follow instructions," he said. "I'm asking you to explain why those instructions apply only to me." Karen cut in. "You're being difficult." Daniel turned to her, studied her face. The tight mouth, the set jaw, the calculation behind the eyes. "No," he said quietly. "I'm being precise." That was when security was called. Now, standing at the edge of the gate, radio crackling, the officer waited for the command. The supervisor's patience had snapped. Karen stood with her chin lifted, convinced she had done nothing wrong. Captain Reeves paced once, then stopped, watching Daniel like a man watching a storm he believed would pass him by. Daniel Mercer breathed in. The sound of engines, the smell of fuel, the weight of years pressing against his ribs. He thought of his father, who had taught him when to speak and when silence cut deeper. He thought of the letter in his bag, folded once, then twice, then not at all. "I am leaving," Daniel said at last. "But not because you told me to." He stepped back. The security officer relaxed by a fraction. The supervisor nodded, already composing the incident report in her head. None of them noticed the way Daniel's hand lingered on the glass, or the way his eyes followed the plane like it was a living thing he knew intimately. None of them understood that this was not the end of a disturbance. It was the beginning of an accounting. Daniel Mercer didn't head for the exit. He turned left instead, away from the crowd, toward the long corridor that overlooked the runways. The noise faded there. The airport thinned out into polished floors and quiet benches where people waited without speaking, as if they already knew the day had gone off script. Behind him, the boarding door finally closed, a dull metallic thud. Final. The plane would leave without him. That was fine. Daniel had already decided he wasn't going anywhere tonight. He sat down slowly, the leather bench cold through his coat, and set his bag at his feet. His hands rested on his knees. They were steady, always had been. The shaking came later, when it came at all. Across the glass, the aircraft pushed back. A tug nosed it into position. Red lights blinked. Engines rose in pitch. Daniel watched without blinking, committing details to memory the way he always did when something mattered. The angle of the wing, the way the captain's window caught the light, the exact minute on the clock above the gate. A woman sat 2 seats away, late 60s, knitting with fast, irritated movements. She glanced at him, then back at her hands. "You okay?" she asked, not unkindly. Daniel nodded. "I will be." She accepted that. People his age knew when not to pry. He reached into his coat and pulled out his phone. The screen lit his face, sharpening the lines around his eyes. He didn't scroll. He didn't hesitate. He tapped one name. Ethan Brooks answered on the second ring. "You miss your flight?" Ethan asked. His voice was calm, professional, layered with the faint static of distance. "I chose not to take it," Daniel said. A pause. "That's not like you." Neither was what just happened. Daniel explained. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just facts. Sequence, tone, words used, words avoided. Ethan listened without interrupting, the way he always did when the stakes were high. When Daniel finished, there was silence on the line. Not shock. Calculation. "Do you want this handled quietly?" Ethan asked. "Or correctly?" Daniel looked back through the glass. The plane was taxiing now, turning away from the terminal. "Those are not the same thing," he said. "No," Ethan agreed. "They rarely are." Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment. He saw Karen's folded arms, the captain's dismissive glance, the supervisor's impatience. He felt the old weight in his chest, familiar and unwelcome, the memory of being underestimated in rooms that decided other people's lives. "Correctly," Daniel said. "All right," Ethan replied. "Then we start with paper." Daniel smiled faintly. Ethan always did. He ended the call and sat still as the airport flowed around him. Announcements echoed, wheels rattled. Somewhere a child cried, sharp and sudden. Daniel waited. 5 minutes later, his phone buzzed. A text from Ethan, 3 lines, no pleasantries. "I'm looping in legal and compliance. This is not a customer service issue. It's operational exposure." Daniel typed back with one finger. "Good." At the same time, 30,000 feet above the ground, Captain Alan Reeves settled into the rhythm of the flight. Autopilot engaged, cabin quieted. He felt good. The delay had been annoying, but necessary. You couldn't let passengers push you around. That was how you lost control. Karen Whitlock passed through the cockpit doorway, coffee in hand. "All set back there?" she said. Reeves nodded. "Good. You handled that fine." Karen hesitated. "You think we'll hear about it?" He waved a hand. "People complain. They always do. It goes nowhere." She wanted to believe him. Still, something nagged at her. The man's eyes. The way he'd spoken. Not angry, not pleading. Measuring. She pushed the thought away and moved on. Back at the terminal, Daniel stood and walked toward the information desk. Not to ask questions. To observe. He watched how staff interacted, who deferred to whom, who avoided eye contact. Airports were small cities, governed by habit and hierarchy. He'd learned long ago that systems revealed themselves if you let them. A uniformed operations manager approached him cautiously. "Sir, are you waiting on a rebooking?" Daniel shook his head. "No." "Transportation?" "No." The manager shifted. "Then I'm not sure I am," Daniel said gently. "I'm waiting for someone to realize they made a mistake." The manager blinked. "Excuse me?" Daniel smiled, polite, distant. "Have a good evening." He returned to his seat. The call came sooner than he expected. "Mr. Mercer?" "Yes?" "This is Linda Shaw, Regional Operations." Her voice was careful, practiced. "We were informed you had an incident at the gate." Daniel said nothing. "We'd like to understand what happened." Daniel leaned back, crossed one ankle over the other. So would I. Linda cleared her throat. Our report indicates there was a safety-based seating adjustment. Does it? Daniel said. Yes. And does your report explain why the adjustment applied only to me? Another pause. Longer this time. I don't have that detail, Linda said. Daniel nodded, though she couldn't see it. Then you don't have a report. You have an excuse. Silence stretched. Somewhere, papers shuffled. Mr. Mercer, Linda said carefully. What is it you're looking for? Daniel looked up at the ceiling, at the harsh white lights that flattened everything beneath them. An answer that makes sense, he said. And assurance this won't happen again. I see, Linda said, though she clearly didn't. Daniel continued, voice even. Because if it does, the cost will be higher than you expect. That finally got her attention. Is that a threat? Daniel smiled again, though this time there was no warmth in it. It's a forecast. He ended the call before she could respond. Across the country, in a quiet office overlooking the Chicago River, Ethan Brooks stared at a growing web of documents on his screen. Incident logs, crew reports, prior complaints, patterns emerging where none were supposed to exist. He leaned back, fingers steepled. You people, he murmured to no one. Another message came in. Internal, sensitive. Previous informal warnings. No formal discipline. Captain Reeves. Flight Attendant Whitlock. Not isolated. Ethan exhaled slowly. Back at the airport, Daniel stood once more. He picked up his bag. The terminal clock ticked forward, indifferent. He wasn't angry. That was the part no one ever understood. Anger was loud, wasteful. It warned people something was coming. Daniel preferred silence. As he walked toward the exit at last, the airport loudspeaker announced the arrival of an inbound flight. Another plane. Another routine day. Behind the scenes, files were being opened that had not been opened in years. Phones were lighting up on desks that had gone quiet for the night. People who believed they were untouchable were about to learn the cost of being wrong. Daniel stepped into the cold night air and pulled his coat tighter. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement, fractured and sharp. He didn't look back. The reckoning had already begun. The town car arrived without ceremony. Dark paint, quiet engine, the kind of vehicle that never announced itself. Daniel Mercer slid into the back seat and gave the driver an address across the river. The man nodded once and pulled away, wipers pushing sleet aside in steady strokes. Streetlights smeared into long amber lines on the glass. Daniel watched them pass and let his breathing slow. Control returned in increments. It always did. By the time the car reached the hotel, Ethan Brooks had already moved 3 chess pieces and was reaching for a 4th. Ethan sat alone in his office, jacket off, sleeves rolled, the city of Chicago glowing beneath him like a circuit board. He had spent 30 years inside systems like this. Airlines, utilities, financial institutions. Organizations that believed scale made them invisible. He knew better. Scale made patterns. Patterns made leverage. His screen filled with timelines. Complaints that had been logged, softened, closed. Language repeated itself. Terms like misunderstanding, tone issue, passenger non-compliant. Ethan flagged them one by one. When the software suggested correlation, he ignored it and trusted his instincts. He didn't need an algorithm to tell him what neglect looked like. He opened a secure channel and typed a short message. Begin parallel review. Quiet. No outreach yet. I want truth before reaction. He leaned back and rubbed his eyes. The clock on the wall read 11:12 in the evening. He didn't bother correcting it. Time zones had become a suggestion years ago. At cruising altitude, Captain Alan Reeves felt the first flicker of irritation that wasn't related to weather or fuel burn. It came without warning, a tightness in his shoulders, a sense of being watched. He shook it off and focused on the instruments. Old habits. You trusted the panel. You trusted procedure. Karen Whitlock moved through the cabin, collecting cups. Her smile was automatic now, fixed. She caught her reflection in the galley mirror and didn't like what she saw. Too rigid, too sharp. She told herself it was fatigue. She'd earned her authority. She'd earned her instincts. People tried to bend rules all the time. Still, the man's voice echoed in her head. Not loud, not pleading. Precise. She finished her rounds and returned to her jump seat. The plane hummed. Lights dimmed. She closed her eyes, but didn't sleep. At the hotel, Daniel stood at the window of his room, looking down at the river sliding black and slow between concrete banks. He hadn't turned on the lights. He preferred shadows. They hid the unnecessary. He opened his bag and removed the folded letter. Heavy paper, cream-colored. No letterhead. He hadn't planned on using it yet. He'd hoped he never would. Daniel read it again anyway. The words familiar, the signature at the bottom still capable of shifting the air in a room. He placed it back in the bag and closed the zipper with care. His phone buzzed. Ethan. They spoke without greetings. "They're dirty," Ethan said. "Not dramatic dirty. Comfortable dirty." That's worse. Daniel closed his eyes. "How far back?" "Years," Ethan replied. "Nothing that explodes on its own. Everything that accumulates." Daniel exhaled. "What do you need from me?" "Patience," Ethan said. "And permission. You have both." They ended the call. At corporate headquarters, lights flicked on floor by floor as night staff were quietly told to stay. Compliance officers were pulled from dinner. Legal teams were instructed to hold off on notifications and focus on internal exposure. Words like potential liability and reputational risk circulated without context. Context would come later. For now, silence was strategy. Linda Shaw sat alone in her car in the parking garage, hands gripping the steering wheel. The call replayed in her mind. The man's voice. The way he'd said, "forecast." She hadn't slept well in years, but tonight the unease settled deeper. She started the engine, then stopped it again. She sent an email she hadn't planned on sending, requesting clarification on flight crew discretion standards. Urgent. She stared at the sent message and wondered if she'd just saved herself or doomed herself. She couldn't tell which. Morning came grey and sharp. News screens in the terminal rotated through the usual stories: weather delays, market futures, a brief mention of airline customer satisfaction rankings. Daniel watched them from the hotel lobby, coffee cooling in his hand. Ethan called again. "We have something," he said. Daniel didn't ask what. He waited. "A draft memo from 5 years ago," Ethan continued. "Never implemented, never approved, but circulated. Language about preserving premium experience. Subjective assessment allowed." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Subjective," he repeated. "Yes," Ethan said. "It gave people cover, plausible deniability." Daniel nodded once. "Who wrote it?" "Senior Operations," Ethan replied. "With executive awareness." Daniel closed his eyes. This was bigger than a flight, bigger than a seat. He felt the weight of it settle, familiar and unwelcome, like an old responsibility he'd hoped to leave behind. "Next step," Daniel said. Ethan hesitated. "That depends," he said carefully, "on how visible you want to be." Daniel looked out at the revolving doors, and people coming and going, unaware of the machinery turning beneath their feet. He thought of his father again, of the lesson that mattered most. When you speak, make it count. I don't want visibility, Daniel said. I want inevitability. Ethan smiled on the other end of the line. Daniel could hear it. Then we wait, Ethan said, and we let them move first. The airline moved at noon. A statement was drafted. Neutral, apologetic without admission. Words like inconvenience and misunderstanding appeared twice. Daniel read it on his phone and felt nothing. An hour later, a second draft circulated internally. Stronger language. Review promised. Training mentioned. Daniel felt something then. Not satisfaction. Recognition. They were scared. At 3 p.m, Karen Whitlock was called into an office at the destination airport. She sat straight-backed, hands folded, answering questions she didn't yet understand. Captain Reeves was summoned separately. He bristled at the request, then complied. Authority had rules, even for those who enforced them. Neither was told why. At 4, Ethan sent one final message. They found the letter. Daniel closed his eyes. That changes things, he said. Yes, Ethan replied. It changes everything. Daniel stood and returned to his room. He opened the bag once more and took out the letter. He smoothed the crease with his thumb. Outside, the city moved, oblivious. Inside, a decision crystallized. He would no longer wait. The next call would not be quiet. The call went out at 5:20 p.m, just as the city slid into that narrow hour between work and exhaustion. Daniel Mercer stood by the window and watched traffic slow to a crawl, red brake lights bleeding into one another like a warning no one ever heeded. He dialed the number from memory. He had promised himself he would never use it again. Promises were easy when systems behaved. The line rang once. Daniel, the voice said. Older, familiar, tired in a way that came only from carrying weight for too long. I was wondering when you'd call. I hoped I wouldn't have to, Daniel replied. A soft exhale. So did I. The man on the other end was William Hargrove, 71 years old, former federal transportation commissioner, architect of regulations that had reshaped the industry decades earlier. He had left public life quietly, without scandal, without applause. People like him rarely made noise. They built frameworks and disappeared behind them. I read the draft statement, Hargrove said. Carefully worded. It tells me everything I need to know. Daniel said nothing. They think this is about embarrassment, Hargrove continued. They always do it first. It isn't, Daniel said. No, Hargrove agreed. It's about exposure. Daniel closed his eyes. They've been using subjective discretion as policy. Hargrove laughed once, humorless. Of course they have. Subjectivity is where accountability goes to die. Silence settled between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. You still have the letter, Hargrove said. Daniel glanced at the envelope on the table. Yes. That letter was never meant to be leverage, Hargrove said quietly. It was meant to be insurance. Against this exact moment. I know, Daniel replied. That's why I didn't use it. And now? Daniel opened his eyes. The traffic below began to move again, inch by inch. Now it's time. Hargrove was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was firmer, sharper, the public servant waking up inside the retiree. If you release that letter, he said, you don't just force their hand, you reset the conversation. That's the point. You'll pull regulators back into a space they'd rather avoid, Hargrove warned. Oversight, hearings, questions people don't like answering. Daniel looked down at his hands. steady. Then they should have answered them earlier. Hargrove sighed. "Send me a copy." Daniel did. Within minutes, the machinery began to hum louder. At corporate headquarters, the first sign of trouble was not a phone call. It was a calendar alert. Mandatory. Red banner. Executive attendance required. The subject line was brief and alarming. External escalation. Linda Shaw saw it pop up on her screen and felt her stomach drop. She clicked into the meeting and saw names filling the attendee list. Legal, compliance, risk, communications. People who never met together unless something had gone very wrong. She leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes for 1 second, then reopened them. There was no room for denial now. She had known it the moment she heard the word forecast. At the destination airport, Captain Alan Reeves sat in a small conference room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee. His jacket hung on the back of his chair. His cap rested on the table, insignia facing up. 2 managers sat across from him. Neither met his eyes. "This is routine," one of them said, too quickly. "Just a few questions." Reeves crossed his arms. "About what?" "An incident on your last flight." He scoffed. "You mean the passenger who wouldn't comply?" The managers exchanged a glance. "Captain," the other said carefully, "we need you to walk us through the decision-making process." Reeves leaned forward. "I did my job." "So you've said," the first manager replied. "Help us understand how." Reeves opened his mouth, then closed it again. He felt it now. The shift. The subtle withdrawal of deference. Authority was a currency. It lost value fast when people stopped believing in it. Down the hall, Karen Whitlock sat alone in a similar room. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them together. She hated that. She had always prided herself on composure, on professionalism, on knowing when to draw lines. A young woman entered, tablet in hand. HR, early 30s, polite, watchful. "Karen," she said, "thank you for waiting." Karen nodded. "Of course." "We're reviewing several interactions," the woman continued. "Not just the most recent." Karen's chest tightened. "Several?" The woman tapped the screen. "Patterns." Karen swallowed. "I've been doing this a long time." "Yes," the woman said gently. "You have." Back in Chicago, Ethan Brooks watched the threads converge. Regulatory interest confirmed, internal panic escalating, media inquiries beginning to circle without landing. He forwarded a summary to Daniel with 1 line attached. "They're losing control of the narrative." Daniel read it in silence. He picked up the letter at last and slid it into a fresh envelope. He addressed it by hand. Careful. Deliberate. That evening, a car arrived at the hotel. Not black this time. Government grey. Daniel rode in the back, hands folded, eyes forward. The city blurred past, familiar and distant all at once. They stopped at a building without signage. Concrete, glass, light spilling out of windows that never slept. Inside, the air smelled like paper and history. William Hargrove waited in a small conference room. He stood when Daniel entered. They shook hands, firm, brief. "You're sure?" Hargrove said. Daniel nodded. "I've never been more certain." Hargrove opened the envelope and read the letter again. His jaw tightened. "This will bring everything up," he said. "Things they buried. Things they normalized." "That's what systems do," Daniel replied. "They teach people what they can get away with." Hargrove looked at him for a long moment. "You understand this won't end with them." Daniel met his gaze. "It never does." Outside, night settled over the city. Phones rang in offices that had hoped to stay quiet. Emails were sent that could not be unsent. People began to realize that this was no longer about one flight, one decision, one man. It was about a reckoning that had been delayed too long. Daniel stepped back into the cold air and pulled his coat tighter. Somewhere above him, planes crossed the sky, lights blinking in ordered patterns. He watched them for a moment, then turned away. The next phase had begun. By the next morning, the story still hadn't broken. That was the part that unsettled people the most. Silence meant someone was choosing it. Daniel Mercer woke before dawn. The hotel room was grey and still, the city muffled by low clouds. He stood at the sink and splashed cold water on his face, studying the man in the mirror. 62. Lines earned, not borrowed. Eyes that had learned when to look away and when not to. He dressed carefully. The same grey coat, the same repaired shoes. No costume changes. Power didn't need a wardrobe. Downstairs, the lobby television murmured with morning news. Weather, markets, a short segment about airport delays on the East Coast. No names, no blame. Yet. Daniel poured himself coffee and took a seat near the window. He waited. At corporate headquarters, the silence broke all at once. The emergency meeting filled the largest conference room. Screens flickered to life. Faces appeared from different cities, different floors, different levels of authority. Legal counsel, compliance, operations, communications. No one smiled. No one joked. The air was thick with the awareness that something had escaped containment. The CEO, Thomas Keller, joined last. Early 60s, measured, polished. He had survived 3 mergers and 2 recessions by never being the loudest man in the room. He took his seat and surveyed the faces. "Brief me," he said. Linda Shaw cleared her throat. "We have regulatory interest," she began. "Informal, for now. We also have internal documentation circulating that suggests discretion standards were applied inconsistently over multiple years." Keller's eyes narrowed. "By whom?" "By flight crew," Linda said, "with management awareness." That landed. "And the passenger?" Keller asked. "Who is he?" Linda hesitated. "Daniel Mercer." Keller waited. "He's not a frequent flyer," she continued. "No elite status, no media presence." "Then why are we here?" Keller asked, voice flat. Legal counsel spoke up. "Because he has standing." Keller turned. "Explain." The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Mercer is a private citizen, but the letter he possesses establishes prior knowledge at the regulatory level. It indicates systemic risk, not an isolated incident." Silence followed. Heavy, unforgiving. Communications broke it. "We're starting to get calls," she said. "Trade press. Not asking questions yet. Just listening." Keller leaned back. "Find him," he said. "Offer restitution. Quiet resolution." The lawyer shook his head. "That window is closed." Keller's jaw tightened. "Why?" "Because he isn't asking for an apology," the lawyer replied. "He's asking for correction." Back in the terminal cafe, Daniel stirred his coffee until it went cold. He watched travelers move past him, rolling bags, checking phones, living inside their own urgencies. None of them knew his name. None of them needed to. The work didn't require recognition. His phone buzzed. Ethan. "They're scrambling," Ethan said without preamble. "CEO wants contact. Soft approach." Daniel nodded. They should have led with honesty. "They never do," Ethan replied. "What do you want me to tell them?" Daniel considered. He thought of the conference rooms he'd sat in over the years, the decisions made by people who never saw the downstream effects. He thought of the flight attendants' folded arms, the captain's certainty. "Tell them I'm available," Daniel said, "on one condition." Ethan waited. "They bring their policy people," Daniel continued. "Not PR, not legal. the ones who wrote the rules. There was a pause. Then Ethan laughed softly. You're going to make them uncomfortable. That's the point. At the destination airport, Captain Alan Reeves sat alone in his kitchen, coffee untouched. His phone lay face down on the table. He had received no formal notice, no charges, just a request to remain available. He told himself that meant nothing, routine, administrative, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the ground had shifted under his feet. He replayed the encounter again, the man's eyes, the way he'd spoken, not challenging authority, exposing it. Reeves had spent his career believing authority was something you carried. He had never considered that it might be something granted. Karen Whitlock sat in her car outside a grocery store, staring through the windshield. She had been placed on leave pending review. The words echoed in her head. Pending review. She had told herself she was protecting standards, preserving order. But order for whom? She remembered the man's question now. Why does this apply only to me? She didn't have an answer. The meeting took place that afternoon in a neutral office downtown. No logos, no signage. A room chosen specifically to avoid symbolism. Daniel arrived early. He took a seat at the far end of the table and placed his bag at his feet. He folded his hands and waited. They arrived together. Keller, Linda, 2 policy directors, legal counsel. Everyone shook hands. Polite, controlled. Tension hidden behind civility. Mr. Mercer, Keller began. Thank you for meeting with us. Daniel nodded. I didn't come for thanks. Keller smiled thinly. We understand you had an unfortunate experience. Daniel raised a hand, not abrupt, precise. I'm not here to discuss my experience, he said. I'm here to discuss yours. The room stilled. You operate a system, Daniel continued. That system teaches people what behavior is rewarded, what is tolerated, and what is ignored. Yesterday, your system spoke clearly. One of the policy directors shifted. With respect, he said, we cannot control every interaction. Daniel looked at him. No, he said, but you can control the rules that govern them. Linda leaned forward. We are reviewing, you are reacting, Daniel said gently. Review comes before harm, not after. Keller held up a hand. What do you want? He asked. Daniel met his gaze. For the first time, there was weight behind his words. I want you to acknowledge that discretion without accountability becomes bias, he said. And that bias, repeated long enough, becomes culture. Silence. And if we do? Keller asked carefully. Daniel inhaled. Then this ends quietly, he said, with reform, training, oversight. And if we don't? Daniel's eyes didn't harden. They didn't need to. Then it ends correctly. The meeting adjourned without resolution. That evening, the first article appeared. Small outlet, careful language. An unnamed passenger. An airline under review. A letter. No details yet. But the machine had noticed. Daniel stood by the window of his room and watched the city lights flicker on. Somewhere, phones rang again. Emails multiplied. People began to understand that this was not a story to be managed. It was a process to be endured. Daniel closed the curtains and sat in the dark. He didn't feel triumph. He felt gravity. The kind that came when a system finally began to answer for itself. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that the hardest part was still ahead. By the time the second article ran, the tone had changed. This one named dates. Not people yet, but dates carried their own weight. It mentioned internal memos. It referenced language that had never been meant for public eyes. It quoted a former compliance officer, retired, unnamed, who described a culture where discretion was treated as wisdom and silence as loyalty. The piece ended with a single line that landed like a dropped plate in a quiet room. Regulators are reviewing whether these practices reflect a broader pattern. Daniel read it on his phone while standing in the hotel elevator. He felt the shift immediately. The doors opened, and the lobby seemed louder, sharper, as if the building itself had leaned in. Ethan called before Daniel reached the sidewalk. "They're convening the board," Ethan said. "Emergency session, full attendance." Daniel nodded. "Good. They're also trying to identify you publicly," Ethan continued. "Background checks, property records, old filings." Daniel smiled faintly. "They'll find what I filed, nothing else." "That's the problem," Ethan said. "You don't fit their model." Across town, the boardroom filled with people who were used to deciding outcomes, not reacting to them. Men and women in their late 50s and 60s, former executives, former politicians, names that carried weight in donor lists and alumni newsletters. The chair called the meeting to order and wasted no time. "This is no longer contained," she said. "We need to understand our exposure." Legal counsel spoke first. "The risk is not a single lawsuit. It's cumulative. Pattern evidence," one board member scoffed. "Over a seating dispute?" "No," the lawyer replied. "Over governance." That quieted the room. Another member leaned forward. "Who is this man?" Operations cleared his throat. "Daniel Mercer. Limited footprint. No public scandal. No active litigation history." "Then why is he doing this?" someone asked. "Because he can," Linda Shaw thought, but did not say. The chair tapped her pen. "What leverage does he have?" The lawyer hesitated. "Credibility." Silence followed. It was the most dangerous answer in the room. At the destination airport, Captain Alan Reeves received the email that made his hands go cold. Mandatory interview with external counsel, effective immediately. His wife read his face before he said a word. "What is it?" she asked. He sat down heavily. "They've escalated." She watched him for a long moment. "Did you do something wrong?" Reeves opened his mouth, then closed it. He had spent his life answering that question with certainty. Today, the certainty was gone. Karen Whitlock sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by papers she hadn't looked at in years. Performance reviews, commendations, notes written in neat handwriting by supervisors who had praised her judgment. She read them now with different eyes. She remembered passengers she had dismissed, questions she had deflected, the quiet pride she had taken in keeping order. The line between order and control blurred as she stared at the words. Her phone rang. Unknown number. "Ms. Whitlock," a voice said. "This is external counsel. We'd like to speak with you." She closed her eyes. Of course. Daniel spent the afternoon walking. No destination, just movement. He passed monuments and office buildings and restaurants filled with conversations that did not include his name. He liked that. Change worked best when it moved beneath the surface. Ethan joined him near the river. "They're bleeding internally," Ethan said. "Whistleblower inquiries. Document holds. Staff getting nervous." Daniel stopped and looked out at the water. "That's how it always starts." "They want a settlement," Ethan added. "They'll frame it as accountability." Daniel turned to him. "Accountability without consequence is theater." Ethan nodded. "So what's the play?" Daniel inhaled slowly. The air smelled like rain and stone. "We give them a choice they can't spin." That evening, the board voted to place Captain Reeves and Karen Whitlock on indefinite administrative leave. The announcement was careful, neutral, no admission of fault. But the message was clear enough to those watching. It wasn't enough. The third article dropped the next morning. This one named names. It did not accuse. It quoted. It laid out timelines. It connected the draft memo to subsequent complaints. It mentioned a retired commissioner who had authored a letter warning about subjective discretion years earlier. It did not explain how the letter had resurfaced. The stock dipped. Not dramatically, just enough to make analysts look twice. In a quiet office with no windows, the CEO stared at the screen and finally understood what he was up against. This was not a man seeking compensation. This was someone auditing them from the outside. "Get him in a room," the CEO said. "Now." They did. The room was larger this time, more people, fewer pleasantries. Daniel took the same seat at the far end of the table. He noticed the way eyes tracked him now, measuring, recalculating. The CEO spoke first. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "we are prepared to make changes." Daniel waited. "Independent oversight," the CEO continued. "Mandatory training. Revised policy language." Daniel nodded. "Those are outputs." The CEO frowned. "What do you want?" Daniel folded his hands. "I want you to admit the problem exists." "We have," the CEO said. Daniel shook his head. "In press releases. I want you to admit it in governance." The room stilled. "You're asking for a finding," legal counsel said sharply. "I'm asking for truth," Daniel replied. "Findings follow truth." The CEO leaned back. "You understand what that means?" "Yes," Daniel said. "So do you." A long silence followed. People shifted, pens tapped. The weight of it pressed down. "What happens if we don't?" the CEO asked. Daniel met his gaze. His voice did not rise. "Then the next phase begins." "And what is that?" the CEO asked. Daniel stood, slowly. He reached into his bag and removed a single document. Not the letter, something else, thinner, more recent. "I stop protecting you," he said. The CEO's eyes flicked to the paper. "Protecting us from what?" Daniel did not answer. He placed the document on the table and pushed it forward. It slid, stopped inches from the CEO's hand. "Read it," Daniel said. The meeting ended shortly after. By nightfall, the company issued a statement acknowledging systemic failures in discretion and oversight. It announced an independent review with regulatory cooperation. The language was stronger. The shift unmistakable. Analysts called it unprecedented. Ethan called Daniel from Chicago. They folded. Daniel looked out at the city. They bent. "That's not enough," Ethan said. Daniel nodded. "No." Outside, rain began to fall, streaking the windows with thin, relentless lines. Phones rang again. Newsrooms stayed late. People who had believed themselves invisible felt the light turn toward them. Daniel returned to his room and sat on the edge of the bed. He felt the fatigue now, bone deep, earned. He allowed it 1 minute. Then he stood. The story had moved beyond policy, beyond apologies, beyond damage control. The next reveal would change everything. The reveal did not come with a press conference. It came with a filing. At 9:15 in the morning, while analysts were still arguing over whether the stock dip meant anything at all, a document appeared in a place most people never looked until it was too late. A regulatory disclosure. Dry title, neutral language, but inside it, the structure shifted. Daniel Mercer was not listed as a complainant. He was listed as a principal. The board learned first. An emergency call was convened with no agenda, no script, no confidence. Faces appeared on the screen one by one, drawn tight, eyes scanning for reassurance that was no longer there. The chair opened her mouth, closed it again, then spoke. "We have a situation." Legal counsel nodded grimly. "Yes, we do." "Explain," the chair said. The lawyer inhaled. "The entity that triggered the regulatory review has disclosed a material position." "What position?" someone demanded. "A controlling interest," the lawyer replied. "Indirectly held, quietly accumulated over time." The room erupted. "That's impossible. We would have known. There are reporting thresholds, there are safeguards, there are exemptions," the lawyer said, voice cutting through the noise. "And there are vehicles designed to remain invisible until they are not." Silence fell like a dropped curtain. Linda Shaw felt the blood drain from her face. She stared at the screen, reading the name again and again. Mercer Strategic Holdings. Registered years ago. Clean filings. No noise, no interviews. No ambition, at least none that had been visible. The chair's voice shook. "You're telling me he owns us?" The lawyer chose his words carefully. "I'm telling you he has leverage you did not anticipate." At the same moment, Daniel sat in a quiet office across town, hands folded, watching the news crawl across a muted television. The anchor stumbled over the phrasing. Unconfirmed reports. Developing story. Market reaction pending. Ethan Brooks stood by the window, arms crossed, watching traffic freeze below as phones lit up across the city. "They're panicking," Ethan said. "Board members are calling favors they didn't know they still owed." Daniel nodded. "They should." "This is the point of no return," Ethan added. "Once this is public, there's no unwinding it." Daniel's voice was calm. It was never meant to be unwound. Back at corporate headquarters, the CEO paced. His phone rang. Again. Again. He ignored it. He stared at the document in front of him, at the signature block, at the dates that told a story he had never bothered to read. "This was planned," he said. "No," Linda replied quietly. "This was prepared." There was a difference, and everyone in the room felt it. At the destination airport, Captain Alan Reeves sat across from external counsel, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The questions had changed. They were no longer about procedure. They were about judgment, about history, about patterns. "Did you believe your discretion was unchecked?" the lawyer asked. Reeves swallowed. "I believed it was supported." "By whom?" Reeves hesitated. The lawyer waited. Karen Whitlock sat in her living room, phone pressed to her ear, staring at nothing. The interviewer's voice was calm, methodical. "Did anyone ever instruct you to apply discretion differently based on appearance?" the voice asked. Karen closed her eyes. Images flickered. Meetings. Casual comments. The nods that meant approval without words. "No," she said at last. The silence on the line stretched. "But," she added, voice barely above a whisper, "no one ever stopped me either." The line went dead. At noon, the market reacted. Not a crash, not a surge, a recalibration. Analysts began revising their language, risk exposure, governance concerns, long-term oversight. Daniel watched without expression. "This is where most people would speak," Ethan said. "Assert control, shape the narrative." Daniel shook his head. "Narratives are distractions." What then? Outcomes. At 2 in the afternoon, the board issued another statement. This one acknowledged the ownership structure. It announced leadership changes under consideration. It emphasized cooperation. It did not mention Daniel Mercer by name. That omission spoke louder than anything else. By 3, the calls began coming in the other direction. Not from the airline, from regulators, from oversight committees, from people who had once dismissed concerns as edge cases. William Hargrove called last. "You did it," he said, not accusing, not praising. Daniel looked out at the skyline. "I finished it." "You're going to be blamed," Hargrove warned. "They'll say you engineered a crisis." Daniel smiled faintly. "They've been engineering it for years." Hargrove exhaled. "What happens now?" Daniel's eyes hardened, just a little. "Now we clean the system." That evening, the CEO resigned. The announcement was brief. Personal reasons, effective immediately. Interim leadership appointed. The stock steadied. The board chair appeared on camera, composed, rehearsed, saying words like transition and continuity. Daniel turned off the television. Ethan looked at him. "You could step in." Daniel shook his head. "I won't." "Why not?" "Because this was never about me." Outside, the city pulsed, unaware of how close it had come to staying exactly the same. Daniel picked up his coat. "They thought I wanted a seat," he said quietly. "What I wanted was a reckoning." The night swallowed his words. The final phase was already moving. The interim leadership lasted 6 days. On the 7th morning, the board convened again, this time without confusion, without raised voices, without the illusion that time would soften what had already hardened into fact. The room was quieter now. Quieter rooms made sharper decisions. Daniel Mercer was not present. He had declined the invitation. Instead, a thick packet sat at the center of the table, bound, indexed, unavoidable. The cover page was simple. Governance Reset Proposal. It had not come from management. It had not come from legal. It had come from Mercer Strategic Holdings, submitted through channels so clean and proper that no one could claim surprise. The chair cleared her throat. "We need to address this." Legal counsel nodded. "This is not a suggestion." One board member scoffed weakly. "It reads like a takeover." Another corrected him. "It reads like a correction." The proposal was ruthless in its clarity. Removal of discretionary language tied to passenger experience. Mandatory escalation protocols. Independent oversight with subpoena authority. A restructuring of internal reporting lines that bypassed legacy hierarchies entirely. Performance metrics tied not to efficiency alone, but to equity outcomes, audited quarterly. "This would dismantle half our operational culture," someone said. "Yes," Linda Shaw replied. "That's the point." She surprised herself with how steady her voice sounded. Across town, Daniel sat in a small public library, the kind that smelled faintly of paper and dust and time. He preferred places built to outlast ambition. He read without turning pages, his eyes moving, but his mind elsewhere. Eaton Brooks slid into the chair across from him, lowering his voice out of habit. "They're fighting it," he said. Daniel nodded. "Of course they are. Some of them still think this ends with policy changes and a few resignations." Daniel closed the book. "Then they haven't understood." "They're worried about precedent," Ethan added. "About other shareholders." Daniel looked up. "Precedent is just history people didn't want to learn from." At the destination airport, Captain Alan Reeves packed his locker under supervision. No uniform, no ceremony. Just the quiet scrape of cardboard as years were reduced to personal items. A photograph, a plaque, a logbook he hesitated over before placing it in the box. A junior pilot watched from down the hall, saying nothing. Reeves felt the weight of that silence more than any reprimand. Karen Whitlock received her notice by certified mail. Termination for cause. The language was precise, impersonal. It cited patterns, not one incident. She read it twice, then sat very still. For the first time in years, She wondered how many people had walked away from her without ever knowing why. The board vote stretched into the afternoon. Arguments were made, compromises proposed, amendments floated, each one peeled back by council until only the original structure remained. It was all or nothing, the kind of choice that revealed what people truly valued. At 4:40 in the afternoon, the chair called for the vote. It passed, not unanimously, but decisively. The governance reset was adopted in full. An independent oversight body would be installed within 30 days. Reporting lines would change immediately. Discretion without documentation would be grounds for dismissal. A message was sent to Mercer Strategic Holdings confirming acceptance. Daniel read it an hour later on his phone. He felt no rush of victory, no surge of relief, just a quiet settling, like a structure finally bearing its own weight. Etten watched his face. "It's done," he said. Daniel shook his head. "It's begun." That night, the company released its most explicit statement yet. It acknowledged systemic failures. It named accountability gaps. It committed to structural reform under independent supervision. It did not frame the changes as generosity. It framed them as necessity. The press reacted cautiously, then intensely, then relentlessly. Editorials followed. Pundits argued. Some praised the shift. Others warned of overreach. A few accused Daniel Mercer of engineering chaos for personal influence. Daniel did not respond. William Hargrove watched the coverage from his living room, remote untouched in his hand. He smiled once, thin and tired. "About time," he murmured. Weeks passed. The oversight body was staffed. Whistleblower lines lit up. Stories emerged, not dramatic, not cinematic, but cumulative. Small humiliations, quiet exclusions. Decisions made in rooms without consequences. The system, once pressed, began to confess. Daniel returned home. He walked familiar streets. He shopped at the same grocery store. He nodded to neighbors who did not know his name. He slept deeply for the first time in weeks. One afternoon, he received a letter, handwritten, from a former flight attendant. She thanked him, not for what he had done, but for what he had made possible, for the space to speak without fear. Daniel folded the letter and placed it in the same bag where the other one had once lived. At the next board meeting, held without him again, the chair spoke plainly. "We underestimated him," she said. "Not his power, his patience." No one disagreed. The airline did not become perfect. Systems rarely did. But something fundamental had shifted. Not fear, not obedience. Awareness. Daniel stood one evening on a bridge overlooking the river, watching planes cross the sky, their lights tracing quiet arcs through the dark. He did not feel ownership. He felt responsibility. He had not taken a seat. He had changed the rules that decided who could. The backlash came quietly at first. It arrived in op-eds written by people who had never been denied anything. It crept into panel discussions framed as concern. Words like excessive, destabilizing, and unintended consequences were used with practiced restraint. Some said the reforms went too far. Others said Mercer Strategic Holdings had crossed an invisible line between stewardship and control. Daniel Mercer read none of it. He learned about the backlash indirectly, through pauses in conversations, through invitations that stopped arriving, through the subtle shift in tone when old acquaintances spoke his name. He had spent his life understanding that power, once visible, became lonely. Ethan noticed it before Daniel did. "You're becoming a symbol," he said one evening over a quiet dinner. "Symbols attract resentment." Daniel stirred his soup. So do mirrors. The airline's internal changes rippled outward. At training centers, instructors struggled at first. The new rules were clear but uncomfortable. Documentation slowed things down. Escalation protocols removed shortcuts that had once felt efficient. Some veterans grumbled. A few resigned. Others adapted. A younger generation paid attention. Cabin crew meetings changed tone. Questions were asked that had never been asked before. Not accusatory, curious. What happens if a supervisor is wrong? Who decides what safety really means? Where discretion ends and bias begins? The answers were no longer vague. In the cockpit, conversations shifted too. Authority remained, but it was no longer absolute. It had edges now, boundaries. Some captains welcomed it. Others felt diminished. One told a colleague he felt like he was flying with someone watching over his shoulder. The colleague replied, "Good." Captain Alan Reeves watched these changes from a distance. He was not asked for input. His license remained valid, but offers never came. He filled his days with small tasks, errands, yard work, long walks where the air felt heavier than it used to. He told himself he had been unlucky. Then he stopped telling himself that. Karen Whitlock took a job outside aviation, customer service for a logistics firm. Fewer uniforms, less authority, more listening. She caught herself interrupting people sometimes, then stopped. The habit lingered. The correction came slower. At night, she replayed conversations she had once dismissed. She wondered how many of them she would remember for the rest of her life. The regulators published their findings. Not dramatic, not explosive. Measured, thorough. They cited systemic vulnerabilities, cultural blind spots, incentives misaligned with stated values. The language was clinical, but the conclusions were unmistakable. The airline accepted them without protest. Other companies noticed. Quietly, policies were reviewed elsewhere, not because they wanted to be like Daniel Nurser, but because they did not want to be him. Fear was not the motivator. Exposure was. Daniel was invited to speak at a symposium on governance. He declined. Then another. He declined again. When a university asked him to guest lecture, he considered it, then said no. He did not want disciples. He wanted fewer problems that required him. William Hargrove called him one afternoon. "You could shape the next generation," he said. Daniel stood in his kitchen, looking out at a backyard he had neglected for weeks. "They don't need shaping," he replied. "They need room." Silence followed. Then Hargrove laughed softly. "You always were stubborn." "Persistent," Daniel corrected. That summer, Mercer Strategic Holdings filed amendments, transparent ones, limits on future accumulation, sunset clauses, guardrails that prevented the same kind of invisibility Daniel had used. Ethan read them twice. "You're giving up leverage," he said. Daniel nodded. "Leverage is only useful until the system adjusts. And if it doesn't, then it fails honestly," Daniel said. The market reacted with confusion. Analysts questioned the decision. Shareholders speculated. Daniel ignored it all. He spent his days walking, reading, repairing small things in his house that had been broken for years. One afternoon, he received an email from a junior policy analyst at the airline. "Thank you," it read. No explanation, no attachment. Daniel closed the laptop and sat for a long time. He thought about the moment on the jet bridge, the hum of the engines, the certainty in the captain's voice, the folded arms, the assumption that the story would end where it always had. He understood now that the most dangerous systems were not built by villains. They were built by people who never thought they were doing harm. That realization did not bring peace. It brought responsibility. Daniel stood and stepped outside. The sky was clear. High above, a plane crossed the horizon, its path steady, unremarkable. Safe. He watched it until it disappeared. The reckoning had passed. The work had not. And he knew, as he always had, that the true cost of changing a system was not what you gained. It was what you could no longer ignore. The first snow of the season came early, light and quiet, the kind that softened edges instead of burying them. Daniel Mercer stood at his kitchen window and watched it settle on the bare branches of the oak in his yard, each flake finding its place without instruction. The world did not pause for him anymore, and that was exactly as he wanted it. The airline no longer used the word discretion in its training manuals. It had been replaced with accountable judgment, a phrase that irritated some and reassured others. The change was subtle on paper, seismic in practice. Meetings took longer. Decisions carried weight. People asked follow-up questions they once would have swallowed. Daniel read the quarterly oversight report once, carefully, then filed it away. He did not reread it. He trusted the process he had forced into being. On a Tuesday afternoon, he drove himself to a small regional airport an hour outside the city. No security detail, no press. Just a terminal with scuffed floors, a coffee machine that sputtered more than it poured, and a departures board that flickered when it updated. He liked places like this. Honest, unpolished, real. A flight attendant at the counter smiled at him. Genuine, untrained. "Flying today, sir?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." She scanned his boarding pass, then glanced up. "Window or aisle?" He smiled faintly. "Window." She handed the pass back. "Boarding in about 10 minutes." Daniel stepped aside and took a seat near the gate. He rested his bag at his feet and folded his hands. Around him, life continued at its usual pace. A couple argued quietly over a missed connection. A teenager slept with headphones on, jaw slack. An older woman read a paperback with a cracked spine, turning pages slowly, deliberately. No one looked at Daniel twice. When boarding began, there was no pause, no hesitation, no narrowing of eyes. He walked down the jet bridge at an unremarkable pace and took his seat without comment. The plane hummed. The door closed. The world moved forward. At 30,000 feet, Daniel watched clouds slide past like continents rearranging themselves. He felt no triumph, no lingering anger, just a deep, unfamiliar quiet. This was what resolution felt like, when it was earned instead of declared. Back on the ground, systems continued to adjust. The oversight body released its first annual review. It praised compliance in measured language and flagged remaining risks without drama. Other airlines studied it closely. Some adopted similar frameworks. Others resisted, then quietly copied pieces of it anyway. Change spread the way it always did in large systems. Slowly, unevenly. Then, all at once, Daniel declined every interview request. He returned speaking fees unopened. When a journalist tracked down his home address and left a handwritten note in the mailbox, Daniel read it, folded it once, and recycled it. He had said what he needed to say through action. Words would only dilute it. Ethan Brooks visited one evening, carrying a bottle of wine Daniel didn't open. They sat at the kitchen table as the light faded. "You could have kept going," Ethan said. "You know that." Daniel nodded. "I still am, just not visibly." "They'll forget your name," Ethan added. Daniel smiled. "That's the goal." Across the country, Captain Alan Reeves sold his house and moved closer to his sister. He took a job that did not involve uniforms or authority. Some days he resented the quiet. Other days he welcomed it. He stopped telling his story as one of bad luck. He began telling it as one of consequence. The difference mattered. Karen Whitlock attended a training seminar at her new company and found herself taking notes furiously. She listened more than she spoke. When a younger colleague challenged her in a meeting, she felt the old reflex rise, then recede. She nodded instead. She learned. At the airline, a junior attendant reported a supervisor for an offhand comment, but would once have gone unnoticed. The report was logged, reviewed, addressed. No spectacle, no cover-up, just process doing what it was designed to do. Daniel never heard about it. He didn't need to. On a cold December morning, Daniel received a small package. No return address. Inside was a photograph, a training room, a whiteboard filled with handwritten notes. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, a line of text underlined twice. Accountability is not punishment. It is clarity. Daniel stared at the photo for a long time. Then he placed it in a drawer and closed it gently. That afternoon, he walked to the park near his house. Children played despite the cold, their laughter sharp and sudden. Parents stood in clusters, hands in pockets, eyes scanning constantly. Daniel sat on a bench and watched. He thought about all the moments in his life when silence had seemed easier. He thought about how often systems relied on that silence to survive. The world did not need more heroes. It needed fewer blind spots. As dusk settled, Daniel stood and brushed snow from his coat. A plane crossed the sky overhead, its lights steady, unremarkable, safe. He watched it until it vanished into cloud, then turned toward home. He had not taken a seat. He had not taken a title. He had taken responsibility. And then he had put it down where it belonged. The system would not stay perfect. No system ever did. But it would remember this moment, encoded into policy and practice and pause. That was enough. If this story stayed with you, take a second to like and subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Comment your thoughts.